a tire? A little rubber, a little air. It's pretty simple, right? Well, what if I were to tell you that the tire is one of the most important parts of a NASCAR car? This is definitely not your family minivan type of tire. It's not filled with air, it's filled with nitrogen. They even make a different tire for every NASCAR track. NASCAR has a ton of rules about tires. They assign them to the teams, inspect them, and then they have rules about treads, the size, the temperature. They even impound the tires for the top 10 qualifiers. Tires are pretty serious business in NASCAR, so why all the fuss over tires? Sports figures, put your brain in the game. Try to imagine a world without friction. Friction is one of those forces that's so much a part of our everyday lives, we tend to forget it's even there. It's a force that's always working for us and against us, like in NASCAR racing. Friction works against a NASCAR car in a lot of ways. Friction between the tires and the road slows the car down. Friction in the engine wears the engine out. Friction with the air burns up fuel. But friction is essential to a NASCAR car. You couldn't race without it. Between the rear tires and the road surface, the car would never get moving in the first place. The wheels would just spin, right? And once the car is moving, friction is even more important. Friction between the tires and the road surface is what keeps the car under control. You couldn't turn without it. Friction that provides what we commonly call traction for a car. The tire's grippy in the road. At the high speed that these NASCAR racers take these turns, they need a lot of friction to stay on the track. So what is friction? And how does it work? This guy back behind me here is Jeff Gordon. Jeff races number 24 for the Rainbow Warriors, and he won the Winston Cup Championship 2 of the last 3 years. He's also the youngest driver ever to win the Daytona 500, so I'd say he knows a thing or two about friction. So Jeff, there's an old adage around racetracks that tires win the race. Now, it would seem to me that drivers, like yourself, win the race, so which is it?
Well, if you ask me, I'm going to say driver, right? But no, that's not true. Actually, tires are a very important part, but there's so many different components that make a winning team and get you to victory lane, but tires are definitely an important part of that.
You recently had a race where changing tires was pretty important.
When you have 4 brand new fresh tires against guys that just took 2 fresh tires on, you basically almost have twice the grip to the racetrack.
Which obviously leads to more speed, which obviously leads to victory.
Well, in some cases, yes. In ours, it did lead to victory. But yeah, basically more grip through the corners makes faster corner speeds, which overall makes a faster race car.
The runners of this sled are in contact with the asphalt. Friction. Now, in order to move the sled, I have to overcome the force of the friction between the runners and the asphalt. Their surfaces want to grab each other. That's why rough surfaces generally have more friction than smooth ones. One of the things the force of friction depends on is weight. Now, if we add more weight, are you ready? The sled is harder to move because it weighs more. More weight means more friction. It also depends what you're sliding on. Now, the sled is easier to pull, even with both of them, on grass. Different surfaces have different amounts of friction. Now, the sled doesn't work so well on asphalt or grass, but on snow. In physics, there's a number to describe the amount of friction force between two surfaces. That number is called the coefficient of friction. Coefficient is a number that describes how something's going to perform. Like if I use 10W40 motor oil, that tells me that 10W40 is going to perform differently than, say, 10W30. Yo. This sneaker has a rubbery sole, sort of like a tire, but this dress shoe has a smooth leather sole. Now, the sneaker against the track doesn't slide very well. This combination of surfaces has a high coefficient of friction, but the dress shoe slides easily. This combination of surfaces has a low coefficient of friction. Oh, a banana peel has a really low coefficient of friction. That's why we don't leave them lying around NASCAR tracks. Oh. Right now, Jeff's car is just sitting here, right? Well, that's because we have the brakes on. You might think there's not any friction going on because the car isn't moving, but there is. There's friction between the car and the wood. We can prove it like this. We'll take the brakes off. See? Friction was holding the car in place. We call that static friction. Static, not moving. But when one surface is sliding over the other, they have a different friction. We call that kinetic friction, sliding friction. The coefficient of friction is different for a static situation and a kinetic one, even if the surfaces are the same. You can see it right here. Look. I have to tilt the board way up like this to get it to move, but once it's moving, I can lessen the angle and it still keeps moving. Static friction is always greater than kinetic friction. It's a little confusing, because even though the tire's moving, it's rolling, it's still static friction. It's when the tire starts to slide that it's kinetic friction. Coefficient of kinetic friction.
Coefficient of kinetic friction.
Coefficient of kinetic friction.
Coefficient of kinetic friction.
Coefficient of kinetic friction.
Coefficient of...
Yes,
You got it.
as you can see, it's not so easy to say. But in physics, there's an easier way to say it.
Mu.
The coefficient of kinetic friction is called mu. Not mu, mu, okay? Okay, I think they got it. So you can have a high mu or a low mu, depending on the amount of friction. Now, the reason we use mu is because in an equation, the Greek letter mu stands for coefficient of kinetic friction. Mu. High mu and low mu. So the mu of the shoe gives us a number for its frictional force against any given surface. But if I were to add some glue to the dress shoe, that would change its mu. The shoe is stickier now, a higher mu. So how do we figure out mu? When a NASCAR driver spins out in a race, it's because the tires slide sideways like this. Now, let's say we wanted to figure out the mu for this single tire here. What are the two things that determine friction?
Weight. So you'd have to weigh the tire.
Correct. So we will use this spring scale here to measure the tire in newtons. Now, is that newtons like the cookie?
No, newtons is a unit force, like pounds.
Correct. Now, the reason we measure weight is because it's equal to the force that the asphalt is exerting on the tire. Okay, so, Ian, what do we get?
500 newtons.
Okay, Jeff, so what are the next two things that determine friction?
Well, the two different surfaces.
Okay, so how do you determine the friction of those two surfaces?
Well, you could measure how much force it takes to slide the tires.
Let's hook the spring scale up to the tire and pull. Very important point here. To find the mu, the coefficient of kinetic friction, we have to find the force it takes to keep the tire moving at a constant speed, not the force to get it to move. We want to find the mu for the kinetic friction when the tire is sliding. Okay, so, Whitney, what do we get?
The scale reads 750. So that means it took 750 newtons of force to keep the tire moving across the track.
Okay, so now we have two forces. The force of the ground pushing against the tire, and the force it takes to slide the tire across the asphalt. That's how we figure out mu. We found that the sliding force was 750 newtons, and the perpendicular force was 500 newtons. Just divide, and we get a mu of 1.5. Okay, so this tire on this concrete has a coefficient of kinetic friction, a mu of 1.5. But 1.5 what? I mean, am I talking about pounds, or kilos, or newtons, or kilos per second squared? Anyone? 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 Okay, well, actually, it's just 1.5 all by itself. Because you divide a force by a force, there's no unit of measurement for friction. 1.5 is a pretty high mu.
So is it because the tire's sticky and the concrete's rough?
Right. Now, what if we were to do the same thing with the same tire, but on a different surface?
You'd get a different mu.
You'd get a different mu for every surface you tried.
Exactly. So how does friction work when a NASCAR car is on the track? Let's go to the Sports Figures blackboard and take a look.
It's what happens in the turns that wins or loses a race in NASCAR. And those tires are the only thing that keeps a car on the track. Heading into the turns at speeds up to 180 miles per hour gives 3,400 pounds of automobile a huge amount of momentum in this direction. Think Isaac Newton here. It's going to take a lot of friction to swing that momentum and bring the car around the turn. Not enough force, and that car's going to keep right on going up here to the wall. Here you see the driver turning those front tires. It's the friction with the track surface that's generating force in this direction, in toward the center of the track, changing that momentum. If there's not enough force, those tires will slide. These drivers make it look so easy, but it's a careful balance between speed and friction and the correct line around the turns that keep the cars on the track in NASCAR. I'm Benny Parsons at the Sports Figures Blackboard.
This sneaker has a mu of 0.3, but this dress shoe has a mu of only 0.1. It's way more slippery. Wood on snow has a mu of around 0.06. Not much friction at all. Mu is almost always in a decimal form like this because it's a ratio between the perpendicular force and the sliding force. Sort of like 2 to 1 is a ratio. That's why even with all this extra weight, the mu is still 1.5. More weight, same coefficient of friction, but more friction.
Force of friction equals mu times weight.
NASCAR racers need that high mu. It's what keeps them on the track in these turns. Okay, Jeff, so when you're taking a turn, you've got static friction, but if the car starts to slide, then you've suddenly got kinetic friction.
My job as a driver inside that car is to take that car to the edge, basically to the edge of that kinetic friction without actually taking it over that edge. And if you have the maximum amount of grip out of the car and maximum amount of corner speed, basically that car is sliding just a little bit.
Right, so you want to find the balance between kinetic and static.
To get the maximum amount of corner speed, absolutely.
What about in those moments when the kinetic friction takes over and you really slide, you go out of control? I mean, what's that like?
Sometimes you can save it, but most of the time it's gone before you even know it. And all of a sudden everything just slows down. You're in slow motion and you just can't believe what's happening is you're actually spinning the car and you're getting ready to hit something very hard.
Okay, so what do we learn?
That friction is the force between two objects, and it can either be static or kinetic.
Correct.
And you can find a number for it called the coefficient of friction.
Right.
And friction depends on two things.
And they are.
The perpendicular force, which is the weight, and the force it takes to slide.
Okay.
And the coefficients of friction will be different for any two surfaces.
Right.
And for kinetic and static friction, we call the coefficient mu.
We call it what?
Mu.
Correct. I think he's got it. And just one more thing. How does this work for me? Well, I mean, it's not quite this, but I think it works. It works for you.
Yeah, it looks good.
Yeah?
Yeah. All right.